All right, thank you all for being here, and welcome to the Oxford Interfaith Forum Monthly Interfaith Psalms Reading and Discussion. Today we are discussing Psalm 131 in a presentation entitled How I Weaned Myself from the Breast of God, given by Dr. Kahn-Harris. Please allow me to remind you to keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking. We would greatly appreciate if you would either submit questions in the chat or use the raise hand icon during the Q&A portion of our meeting. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of today's session, Rabbi Joshua Stanton. Rabbi Stanton is a senior fellow at the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership and rabbi of the East End Temple in Manhattan, New York, USA. Holder of numerous awards, including the David G. Sachs Prize for General Academic Excellence, the Rabbi M. Cohen Award for Ecumenical Studies, the Rabbi Samuel J. Levinson Prize in Religion and the Humanities, the Coexist Prize. Rabbi Stanton served as founding co-editor of the Journal of Interreligious Studies. He serves on the Board of Trustees of the Interfaith America and on the Board of Governors of the International Jewish Committee on Interreligious Consultations, which presides over Jewish-Christian relations with the Vatican and the World Council of Churches. Rabbi Stanton was named a 2019 Faith Justice Hero by the Interfaith Center of New York and received a 2020 Racial Equity and Interfaith Cooperation Award from the Interfaith Youth Corps. In 2021, he received the Ann Friedman Award from the Gramercy Stuyvesant Independent Democrats in recognition of his immigration rights advocacy, and was named to the inaugural class of Sacred Journey Fellows, selected from a group of 1,700 interfaith leaders from across the country. Together with Rabbi Benjamin Spratt, a senior rabbi of Congregation Rodef Shalom in New York, Rabbi Joshua Stanton is the co-author of Awakenings, American Jewish Transformations in Identity, Leadership, and Belonging. Welcome, Rabbi Stanton.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing us together in conversation. I have the privilege, first and foremost, of sharing with you about Rabbi Dr. Deborah Kahn-Harris and her extraordinary achievements as a scholar, as a community leader, and then helping to facilitate some of the conversation today as we delve into Psalm 131. Rabbi Dr. Deborah Kahn-Harris was raised in Houston, Texas, and received a BA in art history from Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. She came to the United Kingdom in 1989 to study at the Oxford Center for Postgraduate Hebrew Studies before entering the Smicha program at Leo Baeck College. Ordained in 1996, she subsequently worked for the Reformed Synagogues of Great Britain, initially as a university chaplain, building up student and young adult work until a new department was formed around her work. Rabbi Dr. Deborah Kahn-Harris was appointed Director of Student and Young Adult Work, sitting on the senior management team of RSGB. In 2001, she departed to live in Jerusalem for a year, where she taught in several places, including Mechon Tashma. After a brief stint as a temporary assistant at Temple Beth Israel in Melbourne, Australia, she returned to the UK, where her working time was divided between serving on the rabbinic team at Shaarei Tzedek, North London Reform, also teaching at Leo Baeck College, and in addition, working on a PhD in Bible at the University of Sheffield and teaching Bible and Jewish studies at SOAS from 2007 to 2009, a very busy life. From 2009 to 2010, Rabbi Kahn-Harris was vice chair of the Assembly of Reform Rabbis UK. She also co-hosted an intra-Jewish dialogue project with her husband, Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris. Her PhD is entitled A Hammer for Shattering Rock, employing classic rabbinic hermeneutics to fashion contemporary feminist commentary on the Bible, which was completed during the summer of 2011. Dr. Deborah Kahn-Harris is currently principal of Leo Baeck College, where she also teaches Bible. Dr. Kahn-Harris, Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the illustrious Leo Baeck College and House of Study, we turn it to you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Stanton, and thank you so much to the Oxford Interfaith Forum, and particularly this Psalms group, for inviting me to speak to you all today. So I'm going to just start by sharing my screen, and hopefully that works well. And I will begin, as is, I understand, the tradition here with the Oxford Interfaith Forum, by inviting Rabbi Stanton to read Psalm 131 for us in Hebrew. As you see it on the screen here, this is the layout by Jan Fockelman from 2002. I think it gives us a good sense of the parallelisms that are rife in this psalm.
Shir Hamalot LeDavid Adonai, Lo gava libi velo ramu enai velo hilachti. Im lo shiviti v'domamti nafshi kegamul elai. Imo kegamul elai nafshi. Yachel Yisrael el Adonai me'ata v'ad olam.
Thank you very much. And so that's our Hebrew. And if I refer during the course of the talk to the different bicolor in the verses, you'll understand what I mean here in this sort of layout. And we're going to also read the English, and I will just ask Dr. Erica Monge-Greer to read from the New JPS translation for us. You're muted, Erica.
Psalm 131, a song of ascents of David. O Lord, my heart is not proud, nor my look haughty. I do not aspire to great things or to what is beyond me, but I have taught myself to be contented, like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child am I in my mind. O Israel, wait for the Lord, now and forever.
Thank you very much. So, just before we go anywhere with this psalm, it is, as Rabbi Stanton and I were discussing while we were waiting for people to arrive, very short. You might think, what on earth are we going to talk about for the next hour or so with such a short psalm? But I think there is a great deal here. And by way of explanation, how did I come to even be interested in Psalm 131? I suppose I should point out that within a Jewish context, this psalm has no liturgical use at all. It's not something that regularly appears for any festival reading, Shabbat readings, anything like that. So there's no particular reason why within a Jewish context one might read it other than sort of the obvious recitation of psalms, perhaps at the bedside of someone ill or something like that. I came to the psalm actually researching something else and wanting to find out something a little obscure about this Hebrew phrase, im lo. Not very exciting, but you know, when one does scholarship, that's the sort of thing that happens. And as I read the psalm many years ago now, at the time I had very young children, and I found myself rather baffled by this phrase. I have taught myself to be contented like a weaned child with its mother. And at the time I had one child that was weaned and one that was still breastfeeding, and it didn't actually make sense to me. It didn't reflect my own lived experience, and I knew even less what it might have meant to be like a weaned child in my mind. I could not begin to imagine what that might mean. And so I found myself engaging with this psalm, trying to actually understand it. And so I will take you through my process with this psalm. And at the end of this, I will present you with my own translation of the psalm, which I hope explains something of what I think it might mean, at least to me, and then you can tell me if it helps you or not. So what is Psalm 131? Well, the commentators, as you can see, are rather rapturous about it. They tend to wax lyrical about this beautiful little poem, exquisite epigram, a beautiful mystical poem. I think mystical is sometimes employed when people simply don't really understand something and therefore think that there must be some mystery to uncover. So I wonder sometimes if the sorts of comments that commentators make are as idealized as the text itself might be. The Sitzim Leben, the superscription we are probably all familiar with, Shir HaMa'alot, the so-called Psalms of Ascent. There is, of course, a whole body of literature about what that might mean as well. Were they psalms of pilgrimage to recite while going up to the temple, to recite while on arrival to the temple? Perhaps. Unlike many of the Psalms of Ascent, however, Psalm 131 has no obvious link with Jerusalem. There is no geographic feature in this psalm, so it's a little bit hard to know why it was included in this grouping. Obviously, there seems, I think, to be some kind of this is what we might call spiritual dimension, but that is true of a lot of psalms. So there's no clarity about why it is included here in the Psalms of Ascent. Its genre is also not at all clear. Commentators range from Mowinckel, who says it's a national psalm of lament, to Gunkel, who says it's a spiritual lament of the individual, and various other things. Dahoud says it's a psalm of confidence or trust. But I'm not sure that these genre classifications are very helpful here at this precise moment. So I want to take a more careful look at the imagery that we find in Psalm 131. And I'm going to go through it verse by verse. So we will start with this first verse. These are our eyes, which we'll see are important. אדוני לא גבוה ליבי ולא רמו עיניי ולא הילכתי בגדולות ובנפלאות ממנו. So what are גבוה ליבי ורמו עיניי? What are these things? Well, we have the lev, the heart, and the einayim, the eyes. They often appear in parallel here, for example, Psalm 23 or Psalm 19, which both have very positive associations, but perhaps a bit more like Psalm 101, verse 5, where you have gavah einayim Chav Levav, which here is translated as the haughty and proud man. We have this idea that my heart is not raised up and my eyes are not elevated. So what does this mean? This is really somebody who is talking about not being full of themselves, somebody who's trying to say they are humble through the use of synecdoche, right? So through the use of different body parts to represent the whole, and that happens often with hearts and eyes. For example, Deuteronomy 29 and Deuteronomy 28. In 29, you have eyes and hearts and also oznaim, ears. And in 28, you also have nefesh, which we will see is quite important in this verse. But it's an interesting way in which the psalmist constructs this, because rather than saying, I am humble and at peace with all, I am calm and stilled, whatever they might say, instead they say, I am not haughty, I am not proud, I am not raised up. So in an attempt to sort of set their credentials as being humble, but they're expressing it in the negative, which is quite curious. It's almost as though they're trying to say that something about their humility is etched into their flesh as well. I think there's something very physical about this. And then in the next verse, we have the use of gdolot v'niflaot, which is even curiouser. So gdolot are all very often God's acts of greatness and redemption. Deuteronomy 10, Job 5 and 37, Psalm 71, 106. This is very common. Niflaot are also acts of God, the wondrous acts of God. And here we have our long list, Psalms and Judges and Exodus and Job. All over the place. We are used to it, but for those of us particularly used to the Jewish liturgy, we will be accustomed to in Job 9, right? Who performs deeds which cannot be fathomed and wondrous things without number. Who does that? Well, God does, right? So the psalmist curiously says to us, I'm not, my eyes aren't lifted up, and my heart isn't elevated, and I also don't walk in acts of greatness and wonder. They're far from me, right? I am not doing these things that God does. So quite curious sort of statement. I know that God is the one who does dolot v'niflaot, and I don't. So again, it's this sort of negative statement, but in an attempt to say, look how humble and lowly I am, the psalmist puts it in these quite negative terms. And it's very curious because you might say, I'm humble and lowly, I'm not like the king, or I'm not like the priest, or I'm not like Moses. Instead, actually, the psalmist doesn't exactly say, I'm not like God, but hints through the use of gedolot v'niflaot that the person or the entity in which the psalmist sees themselves standing in relation to is the eternal one. And that's also quite a quite curious statement. I see him, I'm quite lowly. I'm not at all like God. You know, would we expect any of us to be like God? What sort of person thinks that the person they should be comparing, or the entity they should compare themselves to, is God? So again, although the superscription is Shehamalot le David, which could mean by David, it could also mean for David, it gives us a hint that perhaps the psalmist, if not we actually think to be David, maybe had quite an elevated station already if the entity they're comparing themselves to is God, basically. So we have this sort of curiosity, and I'm curious again about the psychological impact of comparing or putting out there that one doesn't do stuff that God does. So in the first verse already, we have a question about what is the portrait of this psalmist being created through these images. Why does the psalmist use these particular images to portray him or herself to God? Who is actually the psalm directed to? Is it directed towards God, or is it directed towards us as the reader? Right? And, you know, do we believe the psalmist? Is the self-description persuasive to us? Or do we fear perhaps that the psalmist protests a little too much? I don't know. And these are things that I hope we can discuss as we move on. I'm going to move rapidly to verse 2, which is really the center of the entire, obviously it's both geographically, physically the center, but also the heart of the psalm, and also the most complex bit. So again, we have Im lo shiviti v'domamti nafshi, kegamul alai imo, kagamul alai nafshi. And it's really quite difficult. I will go through it step by step. So we start with the phrase that brought me originally, imlo, which you think is pretty straightforward. If not, is it the very, very literal translation? Gesenius says imlo can be one of three things: a conditional sentence, where imlo means unless. And if it's followed then by a perfect verb, then the conditional sense should be understood as having been fulfilled. It can be an expression of an oath, where imlo might be something like certainly, although Rosenberg in his translation of Mikrot Gedolot also translates imlo here as I swear that, but Rosenberg does seem to be out on a limb on his own on that one. Or it can be a simple asseveration. It's just a simple, straightforward sentence. Joan Muraoka, however, says it's part of an interrogative sentence. So in a direct question, we also find, he says, though rarely, this word im, And he cites our verse, Psalm 131, verse 2, as a possible, though uncertain usage here. So according to Joan Muraoka, it's at least plausible that what we have here is more of an interrogative sentence. Have I not? Something like that. The Targum translates it simply as Ele, and most standard English translations you will find have but, surely, no. They seem to miss out the im part quite often. So there's some discomfort with what to do with imlo. Which takes us to two very strange verbs, shiviti v'domamti. And here we have, first we'll start with the root shava shin vav he. Now shin vav he is a homonym, and there are at least two different dictionary entries unrelated to each other for this verb. It's not at all clear. It depends which dictionary you want to pick to decide which root they think it's related to. According to the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, and as a Sheffield graduate, I think legally bound to use DCH these days. It comes from the second meaning of shava, the second meaning there, and it is most closely related, or the best comparator would be to Isaiah 28:25. And that is this verse, Haloim shava panea, and it's a beat referring to the final preparation of soil, of ground, before you would plant grain in it. So why is that important? Well, for those of us who aren't farmers and don't fully get agricultural imagery, grain is actually quite a bit of a tricky crop. You do need to do quite a lot of work to prepare the earth for planting grain. You need to break up all the large clumps of soil. You need to add manure and fertilizer, and then you need to level off the earth. So it needs to be, everything needs to be really carefully prepared and smoothed, but also enriched in some sort of way. And so shava in this sense means something like carefully prepare, I think, which I have sort of semi-equated with compose. So to compose, to get everything sorted, not compose as in to compose music, but to compose oneself, to carefully prepare oneself is a possible way of understanding shava here. Domamti is probably from Daled Mem Mem, although not everybody agrees. It's a plural form, which in and of itself is a very rare form. In the Kal, Daled Mem Mem means to be or grow dumb, silent, or still. However, Symmachus, who is translated the Bible into Hebrew in the late 2nd century of the Common Era, he takes the root as coming from Daled Mem He, which in the PL means to liken or compare or imagine or think or devise. So there could be something in that, I think. Most of the major English translations go for something like quieten or still. But if we assume that shiviti v'domamti are in some sort of parallelism to each other, I think we could translate something like, I have composed and considered my nefesh, whatever that might mean. We'll come to nefesh in a minute. I think, in other words, that the psalmist may be saying something along the lines of, I've sorted myself out, but using some fairly obscure language to do it in. So let's come to this word nefesh, which of course we all automatically know what it means. When I ask Jewish communities what the word nefesh means, they always tell me the same thing. It means that. I mean, it doesn't mean that. That's just a flat fish, but it's a soul. So the problem of souls, right? Not S-O-L-E, but S-O-U-L. And what is a soul? I ask people all the time what they mean when they say the word soul, and they probably mean something dramatically different than the biblical text means by the word nephesh, or indeed means, if we even can translate soul, than what we might mean by soul. So it's a curious question. Nephesh at its root is these things. It is literally, the basic meaning is a throat, a neck, or a gullet, and is fundamentally one's breathing apparatus. It is not some disembodied, airy thing that floats around up in the sky and looks down at you when you're having an out-of-body experience. It's the stuff that makes you breathe, basically. And here we can see from both from DCH and Hallott, a wide range of meanings. As you can see here, palate, throat, gullet, neck, throat, neck. These are the top meanings in standard lexicons. But here there's also some fascinating possible options. Appetite, hunger, desire, mind, breath, being, personhood. The only other definition I ever get aside from soul is it's a personal pronoun. It's like a personal pronoun. It means myself or yourself or something like that. But that's, again, way down the list in terms of what it means in biblical Hebrew. So why then do every single standard English translation only translate nephesh here as myself or soul? I think it's one of the major problems with translations of this verse and trying to really understand what the verse is getting at, is the insistence on only using these terms that I think may be obscuring what is actually meant in this verse. And just to take you through, in case you think I'm slightly nuts and it really just means soul or myself, here are a whole bunch of verses where it quite obviously means breath. The one from Job is certainly one of my favorites. His breath, this is one of those great creatures, monstrous creatures. His breath, his nephesh, ignites coals. His flames blaze from his mouth. It's not his soul. It's definitely his breath. It's like a dragon. He's like a fire-breathing dragon. And here, for example, people are often surprised by the idea that it might mean something like appetite or desire. But here we can see some great examples there as well. And particularly, I think, this one from Genesis 34, this is the story of Dinah, and after Shechem rapes her, basically, Hamor, his father, speaks to Jacob and his sons and says, "My son Shechem, hashka nafsho," he longs for, he desires your daughter. It's not a spiritual thing he wants there. Right, and it's not something disembodied. It's a very physical, desirous sort of thing. But here you can see other examples of desire. And then perhaps most interestingly, and this is a quotation from the dictionary, the Theological Dictionary for the Old Testament, is this: "It may well be considered characteristic that nephesh should be thirst and longing for God, or the courts of God's house. This desire does not fall victim to sublimation. Instead, vitality is expressed in this fashion because Adonai is life itself, and the psalmists never forget that human beings are nephesh against death." And he, for example, cites Psalm 42, "As the heart longs for water streams, so does my nephesh long for you, O God." My nephesh thirsts for God. So there is something in nephesh that is both more expensive than perhaps our standard translations have given over, and also expresses something much more profound and deep in relation to God, and that desire and longing for God as well. that, again, I hope when we finally get to my translation will be reflected and give it a bit more substance to what I think the psalmist is talking about. And now we come to yet another difficult word. It's like every word in verse 2 is a difficult word. And that is this word gamul, not gamal. It is not a camel. Gamul. So a gamul might be this. This is an infant. My son is now 19. He doesn't know I still use these pictures. It might be this. This is an infant who still breastfeeds, but is old enough to take some solid food. It might mean this, which is its base meaning to ripen or mature, to overripe fruit or vegetables is a gamul. Its basic, more normative meaning in the biblical text is to repay a debt or to deal generously with someone. Or it might also mean this sort of weaned child, i.e. a toddler who no longer breastfeeds at all. Good question which one it means. And of course it's used twice. And there will be a question about whether it means the same thing twice. So how do we know what person a gamul is? Well, for example, in Isaiah 28, verse 9, we have, to whom should he instruct in knowledge, and to whom should he discern a message? Those weaned from milk, those removed from the breast. That suggests that a gamul is a child who's completely weaned off of breast milk and no longer requires it for sustenance. Indeed, many of the major commentators say a gamul here is a fully weaned child. Weaning would have taken place between 24 and 36 months. We have that dating from Second Maccabees. Also in rabbinic literature, they list a gamul as about 24 months is when we would wean a child. Clausen, who's also one of the commentators here, says also importantly that a fully weaned child represents a stage in the child's development during which human beings overcome their instinctive behaviors. So actually to wean is to force a very small child to overcome that instinctive desire to be fed by the breast, possibly. On the other hand, we have Rashi. And the Rashi here is Shibiti v'domamti, composed and still, my soul is upon you, like a gamul that's placed on its mother. And what's a gamul? A yonek shadayim. One that sucks breasts. Oh dear. Rashi seems entirely at odds with what we've just seen. And indeed, the Revised Standard Version translates this verse is like a child quieted at its mother's breast, which seems to suggest maybe a child who is breastfeeding. That's how they get quieted at the breast. Now, I'm just going to stop sharing for 1 second only because I just think I forgot to tick a box and it's now ticked, so we should be okay. Great about that. I want to just for a moment, for those of you who have either never encountered a breastfeeding child or it's been such a long time that you don't remember what they sound like, to just listen. Well, we don't need to listen to the whole clip, but my point is simply this. The idea that children who are breastfeeding are quiet and peaceful and angelic is nonsense. Anybody who's ever tried to breastfeed a child will tell you they're noisy, they're uncomfortable, they don't always latch on properly, they get frustrated. It's a lovely image, but it may not be an image of lived experience. So the extent to which a child on the breast is actually quieted is a very interesting question for us too, which we'll come to. The Septuagint, in fact, latches onto the idea that a gamul might be more than one thing by translating both instances of gamul differently. So it says, I shall have sinned if I have not been humble, but have exalted my soul according to the relation of a weaned child to its mother, so will you recompense my soul. And a couple of the other major commentators have tried playing with this. Because of our timing, I'm not going to go into a lot of details here. Leave it suffice to say that Robinson in particular is doing a lot of work with attempting to amend the text. We'll come to that in a minute. But he comes up with this idea that like a toddler on its mother, surely you have cuddled my heaving breast, is his translation. I'm not sure about it as a translation. I'm not sure it helps with our meaning, but I want to just demonstrate that there's been a real struggle amongst in antiquity and in modern commentators on trying to figure out what does this image actually mean. And indeed, here is a range of translations, and you can see that all of them are a little bit challenging. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. I don't know what that means. Maybe somebody else can explain it to me. I don't know what that means. I don't know what it would mean for my soul to be like a weaned child. I don't know. Like a weaned child in my mind. Like a little child, so I keep myself. These things, they feel like they must be very profound, but when I try and pin it down, the meaning sort of slips out from underneath me. What does it all mean? So there are obviously, when you can't figure out what a verse means, there's the question of textual integrity. And there are a number of contemporary suggestions for amending the text, but there is no ancient tradition of textual emendation. And the Codex Sinaiticus, the scribe, attempts to amend the second occurrence of gamul, and then a later editor restores it to its original state. I think we probably have to accept the lectio my son studies Latin and I can never pronounce it, difficile as the compelling evidence. The text we have in front of us, in other words, is what I think is probably right. But it's a struggle. So where does that leave us? What are the images being presented? What do we mean by nefesh? What do we mean by gamul? What is the relationship of the psalmist to these images, right? Because it says in the first person. How does the psalmist understand him or herself within these images? I don't think the text should be amended, but what happens to the images if it is? And what is the relationship between this first verse, Mr. Humility, to this second verse? So I want to just, obviously, I'm sure you are all familiar with hermeneutics of suspicion. I've mentioned my own interest from lived experience. I also just want to say a few things about that. So first of all, infants are not always calm and collected and peaceful and sleepy after they've breastfed. Some of them are colicky and vomiting and have diarrhea. And some of them have lactose intolerance and allergies and everything else. Some children want to feed all the time, and if they can't, they are miserable. It is not a universal experience that it's a wonderful, beautiful thing. In fact, D.W. Winnicott says that some babies hardly ever manage to get satisfied and for a long time cry and show distress even after feeding and do not sleep easily. And in this case, it is very difficult for the mother to make satisfactory contact. So, although there's at least Melody Knowles has suggested that perhaps we should see female authorship here. My personal view is that what we have here is female imagery, but not a female author, because it just doesn't smack of realism. It smacks much more of this sort of Madonna and child sort of, this is a 17th century painting by Salvi, but these sort of idealized images of mothers and children. And indeed, Klein's states very clearly that he thinks the Psalms are all written by men, and that where there are images of women, there are images seen through the eyes of men. And I think that's very much what we have here. So Winnicott says and I'm going to try and finish up soon, I promise, I know. That feeding a child, as I said, is really difficult, and at some level, no child is ever ready to be weaned. Melanie Klein says that we find that when the child feels when the breast is not wanted, but isn't there, that it's like it's lost forever. And since the concept of the breast extends to the mother, it's a kind of synecdoche, the feelings of having lost the breast lead to the fear of having lost the love mother entirely. And this means not only the real mother, but also the good mother within. And I really want us to think about what that would mean if we are talking about a psalmist who feels like he's been weaned by God. Has he lost God? Where might God be if we're weaned from God? In my experience, this fear of the total loss of the good object is interwoven with the feelings of guilt at having destroyed her, and then the child feels that her loss is a punishment for this dreadful deed. The actual experience of weaning greatly reinforces these painful feelings or substantiates these fears. And I think this is hugely important for us as we think about why the image of weaning is here in our psalm. So again, is God mother? Is that the image we have here? What is the relationship of the psalmist to God in this model? And at what spiritual stage of development might we be seeing here? So the final verse, Yechal Yisrael el Adonai me'atav ad olam. These are these lovely repeated phrases. It's very common in the Psalms of Ascent. It's part of the thing that weaves them all together. Yechel Yisrael Adonai is in Psalm 130 already, and then Me'atav ad olam appears numerous times, both in the Psalms of Ascent and elsewhere. Why? Well, I mean, it could have just been tacked on at the end. Possibly it's something about ending these familiar phrases that counterbalance the uniqueness of the image that we've just had. Maybe it's also something about the idea of having to wait for or hope for God that relate to that psychological stage that weaning represents as well. So I want to try and pull it all together. We have all these curiously difficult terms, and this is the translation I've come up with. You can tell me if you like it or not. Eternal One, my heart is not exalted and my eyes are not elated, and I have not engaged with greatness or wonders beyond me. Have I not composed and stilled my breath like a weanling upon his mother? Like that weanling is my desire within me. Hope Israel in the Eternal One from now until forever. And I guess what I was trying to get at is that that child who's been weaned, but is nevertheless being held by the mother, has to find a way to still themselves and calm themselves, because their desire is still for the breast. But that finding the way back to God, waiting for God, is about stilling oneself. It's stilling that thirst and longing for God that nefesh is, in the hopes that God will find us. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer whatever questions I can.
Thank you, first and foremost. What an absolute joy to learn with and from you. And I see a lot of nodding heads as well. So clearly a number of us got a great deal out of it. Yes, if there are questions, by all means, raise your hand using that great Zoom technology. Refer to Rabbi Dr. Kahn-Harris about the best way to begin to draw this conversation to a close.
Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody for listening, for engaging, for nodding your heads along, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. It's always great to get feedback and engagement with one's ideas. I hope that one of the things you'll take away is there is a little gem of a psalm in 3 verses stuck away here in the Psalter that we shouldn't lose sight of. And that just because something is small, I'm a very short person, it doesn't, my mother always said good things come in small packages. So I hope that you will take that away with you, and you'll think about it differently, and also bringing those maternal female images of the divine into our faith communities as well, I think is really important too. And I think it's really based in the text. Next time you have to welcome a breastfeeding mother into your community, maybe you'll think about it in a completely different way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and really bravo. This was a tour de force, even for the Oxford Interfaith Forum, which tends to select very illustrious presenters and presentations. So we are very grateful to you for all of your time and energy and all of the wisdom that you brought to the conversation today. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for joining us today for this reflection with Dr. Kahn-Harris. And next month, we will be meeting on the 11th of July at 1800 UK time to discuss Psalm 130 in a presentation entitled When Music Meets Psalms with Dr. Merav Rosenfeld-Haddad and David Lee. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Bye.
Bye.